Good morning. Uh, so we're continuing our narrative of the Ottoman Empire, and I'm going to complete that today, and we will then begin to look at the sort of the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the implications of that toward the end of this lecture. So to begin with, uh, as you saw, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire revival of Islam, this great Ottoman state, and so on. And uh, most of the Middle East and really down across North Africa and up into the Balkans and even southern Russia and Ukraine were part of this empire. Now, um, this has to be connected with the fact that um, at the beginning of the 16th century, of course, Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese had discovered the um, Atlantic route to Asia with all of its significance. But through much of the 16th century, the Mediterranean route remained very significant. And it wasn't until after 1580 that you can begin to say that it is the Atlantic route which predominates. Um, the Mediterranean route through the Middle East and on to India and China remained very significant. And there was a circulation of goods, but also the passage of gold and silver from Europe, ultimately stemming from Latin America, but gold and silver passing through the Ottoman Empire and animating commercial and economic activity. And of course, the government, the Ottoman state, benefited. They collected customs duties and all the other ancillary taxes. Um, they went up to the state. So the state was very strong. And there is then this relationship between the strong Ottoman state and this flow of money, which has to be borne in mind. Well, on this basis, then, we're looking then at the organization of the Ottoman state and society. Now, the Ottoman state was consciously seen as sort of a revival of the great Arab empires of the Middle Ages, which I talked about in previous lectures, the Arab empires between the 7th and the 11th century and so on. This was a revival. And the Sultan was also the caliph. He was the head of the religion as well as of the state. The two were seen as one and the same thing, and the Sultan occupied really two functions. Um, and the institutions and the whole sort of structure of things consciously emulated the way the previous Arab empires had been organized. So there is this harking back to the old Islamic empires of the Middle Ages. And as I said last time, it therefore followed that the Islamic elite, back then it was Arab, now it was Ottoman, they were the ruling class, if you like. They were the rulers. And they had a monopoly of coercion, of force, of the army, and they directed the navy. They were the people who were the ruling elite. And the tax revenues that were collected that ran this state, the major part went to the was invested in the army and the navy, defense and attack, and so on, jihad. It all came from these tax revenues, and the government and ultimately the Sultan controlled this whole apparatus. And then the rest of the non-Islamic population were what they call the protected flock, the Christians, the Jews. They were clearly conquered people, and they were tolerated, but they had to pay a tribute, taxes, a special tax, based on the fact that they did not convert. And the overall policy, and I'll elaborate this in some minutes, was one of tolerance on the part of the Ottomans. And the Ottoman Empire, especially when compared to the intolerance of the Western Europeans at this stage, especially as the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation raged. This is a period of singular intolerance in Europe. The Ottoman Empire was relatively more tolerant. Of course, there's caveats. Well, part of this found expression, this tolerance, in the fact that in the organization of one of the basic elements of the organization of Ottoman society, because of course the state and its army was in charge of everything, but the different religions, the Jews and the various Christian churches, were allowed to organize their own lives. And I'm not merely speaking about their religious lives, I'm also speaking about their social and economic life. And this self-organization, these bodies were called millets, religious millets. The spelling is given in key concepts and so on. But these self-governing religious communities were the so-called millets of the Ottoman Empire. There was a Jewish millet, there was a Greek Orthodox millet, there was an Armenian Christian millet, and there was also the millet for the Muslims. And these different communities basically were, of course, they had to pay taxes and they had to obey the governors of the Ottomans. But after that, the millets basically ran local government, was basically in the hands of the millets. The state didn't interfere. It's sort of hard to sort of grasp this because we have this idea of the sovereign state and it exists at different levels, but essentially there is one state and it has its levels, but essentially there's a unified and homogeneous Canadian state. And it's more or less the same with the other states that we're familiar with in today's world. But this was a different arrangement, and I'll have more to say about it. Well, as a matter of fact, the Greeks, although they had been conquered by the Ottomans or the Armenians, the Jews, given their overall situation, the fact that they were left alone, provided they paid taxes and didn't make trouble for the government, they were left to themselves. There were these self-governing communities, and the heads of these communities, like in the case of the Greek Orthodox, there was a patriarch, kind of the equivalent of the Pope. Well, this man was the head of, obviously, the religious life of the Greek Orthodox. But he also was largely in control of the political life, local political life. The ultimate authority was the head, the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. Likewise, in the case of the Armenian Church. And these people enjoyed a lot of power. And furthermore, the community was more or less left to itself, so this wasn't a bad arrangement. And so there was a kind of live and let live attitude that developed. And I would say that even in the 19th century, when European travelers, they traveled to the Middle East, and the Ottoman Empire was still intact, they talked about the fact that life was rather pleasant. The sort of social tensions were relatively low and so on. There was a lot of sort of interaction, especially in the marketplace, between these different groups. They got along. I'm stressing the upside now. They got along. People would have coffee with one another. They would socialize. And then they would go back to their religious community, and that would be it. That was the essential nature of the relationship. Now, in terms of, and remember this sort of contrast with the Europeans, because not only are they fighting these religious wars between the two, but also the state, the French state is a good example, the Spanish state. They were intolerant from a religious point of view. The Spanish monarchy wanted everybody to be Catholic. You weren't a Catholic, you get out, or they'll find you, and so on. And likewise, you saw in France, they fought these religious wars in the 16th century, and then a certain tolerance was established. But when Louis XIV came on the throne, no, he wanted a strong state. And for him, these Protestants were a nuisance. They interfered. So he expelled them in 1685. It's the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So the contrast is real. Now, in terms of the upper class, we could call it, or the elite, clearly the sons of people of Turkish origin, they were the sons of the Turkish elite. They were the ones who inherited their positions in society and their status from their fathers and their grandfathers. That's the way it worked. It was sort of a self-reproducing elite. You traced your genealogy back through these families that were the ruling families. However, there was another element which became extremely influential. Some of these people ascending to the highest reaches of power. And this emerges out of what we call the Devzerm system, which, again, the spelling is given in key concepts, but I'll spell it Devsirme. Dev, D-E-V, Serme, Devzerm system, D-E-V-S-I-R-M-E, the Devzerm system. Now, I said that the Ottomans were tolerant. Yes, but the fact is that in the terms of collecting tribute, one of the forms of tribute that they imposed on the Christians, and especially those who lived in the Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, that area, this was overwhelmingly Christian, was that as needed, usually it was every 5 years, the Ottoman soldiers would come around to the villages, and basically every village had to provide a quota of children ranging from 6 years old to around 13 or 14, and these people, or basically these kids, were removed from their parents. They lost their parents, and they were sent to Istanbul. And there they would be placed in the first place in the homes of Ottoman families, where they would be obviously they would be socialized um, as um, um, Muslims, and then they would go to the. Most of them ended up in the military school, and they became the basis of the Ottoman infantry. And remember, the infantry is the main force in these early modern European armies, equipped with, of course, rifle and cannon and so on, swords. Um, and these kids, uh, they suffered this trauma, and then they were trained, indoctrinated, and they were the main force of the infantry force of the Ottoman state. In the tens of thousands, we're talking about. Sometimes the army was 100,000. Well, I mean, you could compare that. We should note this. This was so there is overall tolerance, but you can see that it has its limits. At the same time, I would note that, of course, in the New World, the Catholic Church was busy converting millions of indigenous people to the Catholic faith, whether they wanted it or not. And if they didn't want it, many of them basically perished at the hands of the conquistadors. It was conversion at the point of the sword. So, you know, what we see is that institutional religion is a real problem. God help it. Oh, look what I'm saying. God help us if we fall into the hands of people like this. Um, so, and we could also say, of course, we could say things like, well, look at the residential schools. We're dealing with this now, but this is what it was all about. You take 7 or 8-year-old kids, you tear them out of the hands of their parents. That's a serious thing to do. And I'm just trying to drag, or we could talk about, say, Africa, where in these war-torn countries, we've heard about the child soldiers, where they just kidnap the kids and make them into soldiers. What the psychic effects of that? That's what I'm talking about. The psychic effects of doing stuff like this obviously is horrendous. It's not easy to study this kind of stuff. We know about, it's actually interesting what really happened to the minds of the people in the residential schools, or what happened to the kids who were kidnapped in Africa. It would be interesting to know more about these janissaries. But I don't think that the sources that we have allow us to study that. I would say in general, it should be said that, I mean, what I'm giving you here today, and rightly so, that is to say, history is largely about the deeds of the upper classes. And rightly so, because the upper classes, they rule, and we want to know about how they rule. But there's also another history, and that is history from below. And in recent times, I'm explaining this, there has been a lot of interest in doing history from below. And to a certain extent, there have been breakthroughs in sort of our understanding of the past, because instead of looking at Louis XIV and the elites and the court and all of that, there has been a certain success in sort of understanding the real lives of ordinary people. But it has its limits because the sources aren't there. Most of the records deal with the upper classes. We don't have enough information, especially as you go back. But we do have some, and this new kind of history is quite interesting. So, in any case, you have the Turkish elite, which is reproducing itself. Then you have these kids coming from the Janissary, based on the Devzerm system, who become Janissaries. But also the Ottomans, in terms of these kids, some of them turned out to be really smart. Some of the kids that were essentially captured in this way, kidnapped, the authorities saw that they were smart, and some of these people are actually taken into the palace of the Sultan and given a sophisticated education, and they became part of the Ottoman elite. Despite their origins as youth in these Christian villages, they became part of the Ottoman elite. So most of them were soldiers, but some ascended. And what we note is, as time wore on, and this is one repercussion of this, the elite actually began to split, because you have the old Turkish element, who are predominant certainly, but then you have this new element that really comes from these simple families in these Christian villages, and they emerge, and indeed amongst the Janissaries, they remember their past to a certain extent, and there's a tension, and I would say even conflict. By the middle of the 16th century, these two groups within the Turkish elite are fighting one another, and one of the, I would say, weaknesses of the Ottoman state is that this conflict perpetuates itself. It becomes recurrently, it breaks out. There are mutinies on the part of the Janissaries and so on. They have their own interests, and they're fighting the Turkish elite and so on. Who's going to control the government? This is part of the dynamic of Ottoman history. This is what goes on. Now, there were also, and we have to mention these people, there were slaves. There were slaves. Now, we think of slavery as an abject condition, plantations, and of course that's true. But in the case of the Ottoman state, some slaves taken in war and so on were brought by their masters to Istanbul. Some were brought into the palace. And these slaves, these servants, etc., because they were smart or forceful or what have you, they themselves became influential in the palace. They were part of some of them said that they were very influential government officials. And another aspect of this was the element of the eunuchs in the palace. That is to say, some of these servants and slaves had been castrated, were castrated, especially those who were related to the Sultan's harem. The Sultan had, we're not talking about monogamy here, we're talking about polygamy on a large scale. And some of these sultans had hundreds of wives. And the eunuchs basically were the servants of these people, and they were part of the court. But given the nature of this court and so on, they exercised. So there were slaves, some of them eunuchs, and then there were the eunuchs of the harem of the Sultan's wives, and all of these people were part of the power structure, giving you the power structure. There's the old Turkish elite, there's the Devzerm element, and then there are the slaves and the eunuchs. And we can go beyond this and talk about the role of the women in the palace, in the court, because the Sultan had all of these wives, so many, dozens, hundreds. Some of them had hundreds. Okay, I want to talk about that in a little bit. At the focal point of power, so you have the Ottoman Turks, and they are the governors, they are the generals of the armies, and so on, the Turks. Then you have the Devzirm. Then you have the slaves and the eunuchs of the court at the center. That's another element. And then there are the women, and the women in the court. They, of course, what is this all about? Why does a man have scores or hundreds of women? It's a big prestige. This is a male dominant, this is a patriarchy. And I said at the beginning of this course, one of the characteristics of civilization, now we're getting at the root, and I want to talk about this the women question in history. This is sort of a general parenthesis. I said that in hunting and gathering societies, although men and women do, most often they do different things. Men hunt, women they gather and reproduce, but there's a huge overlap in hunting and gathering societies. The position of women in hunting and gathering societies, there is a rough equality. You can see this even now. Some women are elected chief in the hunting and gathering societies in Canada. We have women as chiefs in the society, and they play a significant role. But as soon as class society develops, class societies, or in other words, civilizations, and the question of property arises, it's then you see that women are excluded and subordinated under patriarchy, and civilized societies are societies of not only class inequality, but also gender inequality. Women are subordinated to men, and it's a spectrum. In some of these class societies, women enjoy a certain relative freedom, but while still being subordinated. In others, women are closely controlled. Well, I would say that, say, if you take Greece and Rome as examples, there was a clear division, men dominated. Women did, especially in Roman society, enjoy, especially elite women, had a certain freedom and so on. They had the right, they held property, and so they had a certain freedom. But I would say that in European society, women were clearly subordinated, and nowhere do you see this more clearly than in Spain and Italy, Mediterranean society. Spain and Italy, women closely control all aspects of their behavior, especially sexual, very completely regulated. And of course, in Muslim society, the same thing, and even more so, including the use of the veil, and so on. And so this is a general characteristic, and I would say that generally, as you go up the social scale, women are actually more and more controlled. They're more controlled the higher up you go. Working class women, peasants, women who work in the fields, they actually are less constrained because they have to work, and etc. So there is this. Well, in terms of the harem, the point is that the Sultan, because he's a big shot, he's a big man, he's the top guy, he's got a lot of all these women. That's the idea. It's status. This is what it's about. And he's powerful. He can have so many wives and so on, and so many children. And so my last remark about this is that, therefore, you can see if this is the case, and it was the case in Europe, although I would say that in Europe, as you went north, let us say into Germany or into Scandinavia, or England even, although it was a property system and women were dominated, there was more freedom in Northern Europe than there was in the South. So you can see that the appearance of the suffragettes at the end of the 19th century, that is to say, the demand for the vote, the part of women, this had been building up since the 18th century, but it came to a head at the end of the 19th century. The appearance of the suffrage, that was revolutionary. Women demanding the vote, they got the vote by World War I. And then we have, of course, from the 1960s onwards, the women's liberation movement, the arrival of feminism. This is huge in terms of, if you look at history and this property system that goes back to 5,000 years, suddenly it's breaking down. And of course, we're talking about today. And this, as I say, it's profound. Some people are frightened by it, and to the point where they revert to a kind of what I would call neo-traditionalism. That is, say, people who are reactionary. Bring back the good old days. We have whole movements like this. You can see they're playing out in the States. They could come here. We want to go back to the good old days, and we're going to go back to the good old days. And maybe they will go back to the good old days. I have no idea. But what I'm saying is this is extremely important development, and some of it is negative in the sense that there is a kind of dissolution of family ties. There are obviously problems with this so-called liberation, but I'm not going to go further with this. We go back to the Ottoman Empire. So that is the structure of things at the center of power. And then there is the sort of the structure of the various arms of the government, which I'm speaking about now. The various, and we could say that the external to the harem, there was what was called the outer service. The outer service, those were the basics from taxes, administration, military, religious. They were the basic arms of the Ottoman government. So you have basically a imperial council, which there was an imperial council, and at the head of the imperial council was somebody called the Grand Vizier. It's in key word, Vizier, the Grand Vizier. He was the prime minister. And there would be a council of both religious leaders and political and military leaders who formed this governing council. And then below them, there was what was called the scribal institution. These are the people who wrote and kept the public administration, the keeping of the public records, writing letters, and also administering the tax system. So administration and taxes, that's the scribal institution. Then there is the military institution. And the military institution, I've already mentioned one of the elements, and that is to say the janissaries, the infantry, that's the main arm. But in addition to the infantry, there was the cavalry, who were called sipahis. And again, key concept, sipahi, S-I-P-A-H-I, they were called sipahis, and they were all Turks by genealogy. The old families, it's prestigious. You ride around on a horse. and you're a member of the cavalry. So there's the Janissaries, who are ultimately of Christian origin, then there's the cavalry. They are clearly Turk. There's a lot of statists and so on involved, and they also become the governors, the administrators, who are called Timurs, governors and administrators. They are the Timur. These are government functionaries. They come and go in the different provinces, and they control the armed forces at the local level. So you have the Janissaries, you have the Sepoy cavalry, then you have the Navy. And we saw that the Navy really is founded as a result of the deal between Suleiman the Magnificent and Barbarossa, the Algerian governor, and I said that the base, a lot of the sailors are Greeks, but of course the commanders are Turks or Arabs, and the Navy largely operates on the Mediterranean, to a certain extent in the Persian Gulf or in the Red Sea, but mainly it's in the Mediterranean. And the customs duties, export and imports, everybody pays fees, and those fees support the Navy. That's the way the Navy. The last arm is basically the artillery corps, the artillery, which in early modern warfare, artillery didn't exist in the Middle Ages, but of course, as I explained, from the 15th century onwards, this is a part of all states now, and manufacturing artillery is very important, knowing how to use them. And in Istanbul, there was a very large armory which produced cannons, muskets, and so on, but also cannon on a very large scale. They brought in some of these Italian experts, and in the heyday, the armory was turning out over 1,000 cannon a year. They were manufacturing cannon. This is completely comparable to what was being done in the major European states at the same time. So there are the four elements to the army. Then there is so we have this the scribal institution, we have the military institution, and the last of these is the religious institution or the cultural institution. Well, the cultural institution administers obviously religious life. It oversees the millets, but more centrally, this is an Islamic state. Sunni Islam is the official religion. And so the caliph is the head, the sultan is the head, but below him is an individual who's called the Sheikh al-Islam, and he is the sort of religious prime minister. He administers he oversees the practice of the official faith, because this is a state in which religion and politics are fused. There is no separation between church and state. They're one and the same thing. Under the Sheikh al-Islam is a council, and it's made up of obviously major religious figures, but some of these religious figures, and this is significant, are basically trained in Islamic law, because especially in Sunni Islam, the interpretation of the Quran in a legal sense is very important. And so these sort of religious legal scholars have a very important place. So I've sort of explained how the whole thing worked. talked a little bit about the religious aspect of this. I would just say that just to compare it with Europe, what we see in Europe, there we see that going back to the Middle Ages, there did develop a certain split between the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope. There was a kind of separation, and the Western legal scholars recognized this separation. But we saw during the Reformation, and indeed the Counter-Reformation, that in fact religion was confessionalized, whether it was a Catholic state or a Protestant state. The ruler politically controlled the state in both the Protestant and the Catholic countries. So in a way, there was a similarity. It is only we see in Holland and in England toward the end of the 16th century and in the 17th century that rulers, whether they like it or not, are forced to accept non-Orthodox Christianity. For example, in Holland, the official religion is Calvinist, and only Calvinists can be part of the government in independent Holland. It's the Dutch Calvinists who control the state. Likewise, in England, we can say that after the Revolution, after 1660, the monarchy is restored, and the Anglican Church, well, that's the official church. And only Anglicans can have government posts. Indeed, if you want to go to university, you have to be an Anglican. They don't accept people who are not Anglican. But there is, by then, a policy of toleration. People who are dissident, they can be Baptists, they can be Congregationalists, they can be Mennonites. They are accepted by the Dutch state or the English state. Indeed, in both of these states, and these were the only states, Jews were tolerated by both the Dutch Republic and by the English state by the second half of the 17th century. In England, it was particularly Cromwell who he readmitted the Jews to England. One last feature of that we should note was that the whole question of property rights in the Ottoman Empire. In theory, all property belonged to the Sultan, to the state, to the Sultan. All property within the state, in theory, belonged to the Sultan. And people in the West where property rights were developing, they were not fully established. The first place where they were fully established in the West was in England after the Revolution in England, the last half of the 17th century, what we call absolute rights to property. No, rights were conditional in the West based on the feudal system. You had obligations. If you held property, you had obligations toward the monarchy, toward your subjects. Rights were conditional in the West. It's only when capitalism had fully consolidated itself at the end of the 17th century that in England absolute property rights are established. In the Ottoman Empire, in theory, property was in the hands of the Sultan. However, that was the theory. In practice, the ordinary merchants or craftsmen or peasants enjoyed a conditional property. They enjoyed their property. Uh, they were able to pass their property from one generation to the next, um, provided they were obedient subjects and they paid their taxes, just like in the West. Where this was significant was amongst the upper class, because the upper class, under the Sultan, they could not, as in the West, landlords enjoyed enormous property rights. In the West, there were landlords, this had developed already under feudalism, decentralized economic and political power, and landlords had a lot of property rights. That was not true in the Ottoman Empire. Rights were conditional. And I say this because in terms of the development of capitalism as a system, secure property rights are an essential aspect of capitalism. So now I want to move on and talk a little bit more about the millets as we conclude this lecture. I want to talk about the millets, the self-governing religious communities. And I said that there were 4 millets at the local level. We're talking now about both religious life, but also local government, because the millets were the basis of. There was the Greek Orthodox. There was the Muslim Islamic millet. There was the Greek Orthodox. There was the Armenian millet, and there was the Jewish millet. These were the 4 big. And they had developed, already under Mehmed II, we see some movement toward this. They evolved over time, they consolidated over time. It's by the end of the 16th century, the millet system was fully established. Now, we've already talked, we saw that the Muslim millet, there was a Sheikh al-Islam who was the executive of that millet. The Armenian and the Greek millet, and we should mention that the Armenian millet also included other minor Christian churches like the Copts or the Nestorians. There were various different sort of forms of Christianity that had developed historically. They were under the Armenian millet. So there was the Muslim millet, there was the Greek Orthodox millet, there was the Armenian millet, and then there was the Jewish millet. Now, the Jewish millet did not have a head. There was no head. The government tried to make the Grand Rabbi in Istanbul the head of the Jewish millet, just like the Greek Orthodox had their patriarch, the Armenians, their patriarch, and the Muslims, their sheikh. There should be the Grand Rabbi. But the Jewish community, first of all, was divided. It was split into 4 groups. I will carry on and finish. We'll talk about the decadence of the Ottomans next time.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Here.